All right, guys, we're going to talk now about your adaptive immune system. So, all right, so we want to completely separate this out in our mind from innate, okay, because the system is a little bit different. And as I said in the first video on immune system, it's not that they're independent and completely separate and never speak. They work together, okay, but their mechanism of action is different, okay? So first off, adaptive immunity has got some features that make it a little bit different than your innate immunity. So first of all, it's specific. The second one is it's systemic. And the third one, and probably the coolest feature, it has memory. Okay, so let's break this down. It's specific, meaning it's directed at a certain pathogen. It's systemic, meaning it's not just restricted to the initial site of infection. It's systemic, meaning it can go everywhere and do everything. So not restricted to an area. And probably the coolest feature is it has memory. After the initial exposure, it can recognize and mount a second attack. And in fact, that attack is usually more vigorous than the first. So your adaptive immune system can remember and recognize things repeatedly throughout your lifespan. Okay, so there's no restart every time. You don't have to start the whole thing over and restart it every single time. Your adaptive immunity can remember things and say, oh, I've seen that before, and go after it, which is fantastic. So there are two branches to your adaptive immunity. You have your humoral-based immunity and your cellular arm. I like to think of these as kind of two arms of the same being. So we have humoral immunity, so we think humoral blood-borne body fluid, and then we think cellular immunity. This is more like hand-to-hand combat, okay? It's cell-to-cell combat. So your humoral immunity is born from your lymphocytes. Specifically, your B lymphocytes, okay? Over here, cellular immunity is your T lymphocytes. Okay, so we're going to talk right now about humoral immunity, and then we'll talk in our last video on cellular-based immunity. Okay, so today we're going to focus on this lesson, we're going to focus on our B cells. Humoral immunity involves antibodies. So we're going to talk about antibody production and how it's done, etc. Okay, what triggers our adaptive immune system, right? So when we talked about inflammation, the trigger was injury, right? So what triggers our adaptive immunity? Let's talk about that first. Okay.
Week one was kind of novelty. Week 3, 4,
All right. So now we have to introduce the concept of what is an antigen, okay? An antigen triggers your adaptive immune response, okay? An antigen is a substance that can mobilize your immune system and get your adaptive immunity to respond, okay? These are sometimes large, more complex molecules that are not self. Sometimes they're fairly complex, and they are classified as what's called non-self. And I'm going to define what that means in a second. You may have a complete antigen or incomplete. An incomplete antigen is a smaller, just as the name would imply, incomplete, often not immunogenic, meaning you're not getting a full immune response molecule. But Where incomplete antigens are important is an allergic response, which we're going to discuss allergies in the last video. Okay, so first let's talk about identification of self, because this term is a little confusing. Okay. So we have self versus non-self. Okay, so once upon a time in A&P 1, when you learned about the cell membrane, you learned about things that were associated with the cell membrane. So if we draw just a basic cell membrane, okay, so here's the interior of our cell. We learned that there were different kinds of proteins associated with the membrane. So some of them, remember, you had transport proteins, you had channel proteins, and then you had another type of protein attached to the membrane, kind of that's sticking off of that, and these were recognition peptides. These were proteins that were kind of glycoproteins, so they had a sugar group associated with them that were kind of reaching off the membrane, that were in place for recognition. So they were recognition peptides or recognition proteins, okay? So then we think recognition of what, okay? So what these peptides are in place to do, why are they here, is they tell your immune system what's self. Okay, so these proteins are coded for by genes from something called the MHC. Okay, so the genes of the MHC code for those recognition proteins. What does MHC mean? And now this is going to make a lot of sense, I promise. All right, so we have the major histocompatibility complex. Okay, so this is a complex of genes. It's not one gene, it's several. Histo, remember histology is the study of tissue, compatibility, right? So this tells us the code for which proteins will be placed at the surface of all of your cells that will tell your immune system that that's you, it's yourself, okay? If you encounter something that is non-self, okay, it has different peptides. It has different recognition proteins. It's not you. It has a different set. Okay? So your immune system, if this is your, right, my fingers are your recognition peptides, and then I see something that looks like this, your immune system sees the thing that looks like this and says, that's not self. So if you have something that is non-self in you, what should you do? Kill it. Wipe it out. So when something does not have your self, those particular recognition peptides, your body sees this as it's got to go. And so it will go after it with a very specific immune response. Okay? Sometimes this backfires, and we'll talk about times when this backfires in a moment. But first we're going to talk about the cell type of your humoral immunity, and that's your B lymphocytes. Okay. This cell type, the lymphocytes, all of them originate in your red bone marrow. That's their origin. Remember, that's where we find the stem cell, that hematopoietic stem cell that's going to give rise to all of the formed elements of blood, okay? The B lymphocytes will originate in the red bone marrow, and then they will become mature there. So think B for bone marrow. So the B cells will mature or become immunocompetent inside the bone marrow, okay? When we get to the T cell population, it is a slightly different story, okay? So what are your B lymphocytes doing? They oversee all of your humoral immunity. Okay, so they're overseeing your